Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. Our guest today is Ilan Berman, who is going to bring us the latest details on a war that seems not to have gone the way many American experts thought it would back in 2022. Ilan is, in my view, the best person to explain what's happening in Ukraine and the implications not only for Ukraine, but for Russia, Europe, and the United States. And I'm pleased to note that an awful lot of you seem to think as I do, because we have a large audience today in the middle of July, so you must be ready for this. Before we go to Ilan Berman, however, you will get your JPC commercial. We were established in 1985 as a 501c3, providing analysis of both foreign and domestic policies. You can find us on our website at jewishpolicycenter.org. That's jewishpolicycenter.org. There you can read our insight articles and see our magazine In Focus, and you can catch up on webinars that you might have missed. The summer issue of In Focus is up there now. Our authors considered what's happening as the United States appears to be withdrawing from certain parts of the world, and other countries, China, Russia, and Iran, mostly, appear to be filling the gaps. It's a good issue. You should read it. The JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. And we agree with Israel's President Isaac Herzog yesterday, who said to the joint session of Congress, questioning the Jewish people's right to self-determination is not legitimate diplomacy, it is anti-Semitism. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center in U.S. terms, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, and energy security, as well as free speech and intellectual diversity. In this series of calls, we've been pleased to bring you scholars and policymakers on issues including China in various permutations, Israel, including the Abraham Accords, but not only that, domestic security, anti-Semitism, the U.S. Supreme Court, the defense budget, Turkey, and more. Today, it's Ukraine and the implications of the ongoing war there. You are muted, as you know, but please use the Q&A function. We're monitoring. And now our program. Ilan Berman is Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council, an expert on regional security in the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Russian Federation. He has consulted for the CIA, as well as the Departments of State and Defense, and provided assistance on foreign policy and national security office issues to a range of government agencies and congressional offices. Ilan is a member of the Associated Faculty at Missouri State University's Department of Defense and Strategic Studies. A frequent writer and commentator, he has written for and spoken to all the outlets you would expect he has here and abroad. He's the author of several books, including Iran's Deadly Ambition, The Islamic Republic's Quest for Power, and Tehran Rising, Iran's Challenge to the United States. Both of these are terrifying. You should read them. My personal favorite is Implosion, The End of Russia and What It Means for America. And that's a topic for another day, but we may look at it just a little bit here. Most recently, Ilan is the author of Wars of Ideas, Theology, Interpretation, and Power in the Muslim World. And with that, Ilan Berman, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. And that's quite an introduction. I would start by pointing out that the title for my Russia book, Implosion, was the product of an overly zealous marketer, but it does seem very, if not prescient, then at least applicable in certain parts to what we've actually been seeing in recent weeks with regard to Russia. So my sort of disclaimer from the start is that when Shoshana and I talked about this topic, we intentionally left this very vague because we were aware that what we discussed 3 weeks ago might be totally different in terms of what we're looking at right now. And lo and behold, you know, we had a maybe a revolution or an attempted revolution, a putsch, a mutiny, something like that, which sort of intervened in the meantime. So what I'd like to do is just spend a few minutes on three big ticket items, right? To me, there's a lot of things we can discuss, but in terms of trying to sort our thinking about what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, there's really three things to look at. The first is what's happening within Russia internally. And in this context, the Pregosian almost coup, sort of coup, is very important both for what it was and what it wasn't, and what it might signify in terms of Russian leadership moving forward. The second is the counteroffensive itself. Ukraine was supposed to have a spring counteroffensive. It is now a summer counteroffensive. It is moving more slowly than many people predicted. It's certainly moving more slowly than the Ukrainians would like, but it's not out of steam yet. And there's all sorts of really interesting things that are happening that we're liable to to be of significant importance over the next several weeks. And the third is the perennial one, which is the state of American strategy. Are we doing a good job? What are our objectives? There's a lot of ambiguity here. Some of it is intentional, some of it is not intentional. And there's the potential for significant problems and significant tensions with our allies. So that's sort of just a very quick scene setter. Let me start with Pregosian and sort of what we saw happen. So the first thing to talk about is, what is Pregosian? And I say this advisedly, and I mean, what is Pregosian, not who, because Pregosian is pretty well known, and he sort of rose to notoriety, rose to infamy in the context of the Ukraine war over the last year and a half. But people who were Russia watchers like myself knew about him a long time ago, because he is this oligarch, this former restaurateur who served, did a stint in Russian jail, who somehow ingratiated himself into the inner circle of the Kremlin. He became the caterer of choice for Vladimir Putin, and became the caterer for kind of like a White House caterer, sort of. He from there he went on, and he let 1,000 flowers bloom. So he transitioned from being a restaurateur into being a propagandist, because the Internet Research Agency, the notorious troll farm, that was responsible for a lot of the misinformation coming out of Russia that we saw around and after the 2016 election, was actually generated by an enterprise, a concern that Pregosian had funded and had built. And he's actually talked publicly about the fact that this was absolutely his baby. This was an effort that was blessed by the Kremlin that he embarked upon. And most conspicuously, he is a warlord. He is the head of Wagner, which is Russia's most notorious and most significant mercenary outfit. Not the only one. There's lots of other ones, right? There's groups called Sheep and all sorts of others that are associated with the Interior Ministry, associated with the Defense Ministry, and others. But Wagner is far and away the most important one, and it has a global footprint. And for a long time, for a number of years, Wagner has been much more conspicuous abroad than it has been within Russia itself. Wagner was essentially a foreign policy shaping tool for the Kremlin to create outcomes, asymmetric outcomes in places like Africa. Wagner is deployed still in about half a dozen countries in Africa. It was deployed in Syria. It still is to a large measure. And so the Ukrainian deployment for Wagner was actually just the latest in its set of overseas engagements. But in the process, over the last half decade, Wagner has become this real sort of powerful shaping tool that has been carrying out the priorities of the Kremlin, and has essentially allowed the Russian government to pursue a very low-cost asymmetric option in which it's supporting international allies of the Kremlin without actually having to put regular military boots on the ground, without having to make major investments, essentially propping up dictators that Vladimir Putin likes. So that takes us back to the question, what is Pregosian? Because when the tensions between Pregosian and the Kremlin began to arise, and they started to arise several months ago when Pregosian started complaining about poor resources flowing from the Ministry of Defense to his troops, sort of a lack of connectivity, not allowing his guys, who were the tip of the spear in the Russian offensive against Ukraine, to actually succeed. There was a lot of questions about whether he was actually voicing legitimate concerns or he was a stalking horse, right? And the first argument is that he legitimately has equities in this fight, and he wants Russia to succeed, and he thinks that the venal military brass in Moscow is not doing enough. The second option is that he is a stalking horse. He is being presented as a meaner Vladimir Putin in the context of Western opinion, right? And the thinking here goes, Vladimir Putin is a terrible guy, but he's our terrible guy. Imagine what would happen if Vladimir Putin left, which is something that Western governments increasingly have been talking about. He might be replaced by somebody who is meaner, who is more ruthless, who is more effective than Vladimir Putin has been to date, right? So that has been the sort of the creative question. Is what is Prigozhin? Is Prigozhin a real boy in the way we talk about Pinocchio sort of deciding that he's a real boy, or is he just a stalking horse? So this was clarified at the end of June because it became very clear that Prigozhin was in fact a real boy. That Prigozhin had in fact legitimate grievances with the Russian government and had decided for his own internal purposes to position himself in opposition to the Kremlin. The degree of opposition is not clear. It's not clear still what exactly he was thinking. He was clearly fighting against poor resourcing by the Russian military. He was fighting against people in Moscow that were arguing that Wagner needs to lose autonomy, get subordinated to the traditional military structures in Moscow. But what he was going to do about it, we still don't really know. The Wall Street Journal had a great piece a couple of weeks ago about clarifying at least some of this. Apparently, Prigozhin's initial plans involved taking marching to Moscow and getting his hands on, capturing, holding the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, and the Russian chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov. And when those, according to the Wall Street Journal's reporting, when those initial plans were found out, he was sort of put in a little bit of a bind. He was forced to move, and he had to make some hard choices because it's not clear that he was prepared to carry out a coup against Vladimir Putin, right? For a hot minute, we were all on that weekend, we were all on social media, we were watching the news, we were very, very excited about the potential for change in Russia. Also a little bit trepidatious because politics in Russia tend to go from bad to worse. But generally speaking, we thought that there was potential for change. And then very quickly, the scenario shifted. Prigozhin looked like he was giving up the fight and, accepted a handcrafted deal, a deal crafted by Alexander Lukashenko, the dictator of Belarus, that allowed him to assume exile in Belarus, allowed him to receive amnesty, allowed his troops to get reintegrated into Russian society or the Russian military. But it seemed like a very, very abrupt climb down. And it seems to me that what Prigozhin was trying to do was not to effectuate regime change in Moscow, but Prigozhin was trying to demonstrate by force that he had the commanding heights of the political discussion. Because as those of you that follow Russian politics know, he would not have attempted something like this if he did not feel like he had at least certain centers of power in Moscow in support of him, that he felt that he had political top cover to do what he was going to do. And he also learned by doing. So the Prigozhin march to Moscow included his effective takeover, his march into and takeover of two cities, Rostov and Voronezh. Rostov is important because Rostov is the seat, the military seat of command for the Russian Southern Military District. And what we didn't see was a civil war break out between the Russian military and the Wagner mercenaries. And that was a very important teachable moment, both for Prigozhin and for Putin himself. The Russian military, which understands very well that the Russian war effort in Ukraine is not going nearly as well as they would have liked, as their leadership would have liked, was effectively sitting on the sidelines. They said, you know what, we'll wait. We'll wait and see if what Prigozhin is doing is actually going to create any change. And that was very important and emboldening for Prigozhin. And it was also very important, very worrying for Vladimir Putin, which is why Vladimir Putin escalated, which is why Vladimir Putin announced that Prigozhin was committing treason and, essentially sanctioned his killing. Things sort of unfolded against Prigozhin very rapidly from there. So that's sort of what we know. There's other things there too, but the lessons of this, I think, are actually very interesting, right? So the first is that there's real structural problems within the Putin regime, right? Nothing succeeds like success. And the Russian war effort in Ukraine over the last year and a half is very clearly not a success. And so as the war effort drags on, as Western sanctions impact the Russian economy, as Russian military men, boys, return home in body bags, the popular sentiment is shifting within Russia. It doesn't mean that the plurality of Russians oppose the war. In fact, there's been really interesting studies done by Russian opposition media outlets about how, in fact, the majority of Russian society is still generally agnostic. And, there are the people who are very much, ultra nationalist, they're very much with Putin. They're the people who are sort of pro-Western Democrat. They're very much against Putin. But that middle space where people are undecided and all they want is for the war to be far away and not to affect their daily lives is actually very great. And the problem with that is that in that context, time works against Vladimir Putin, because the more the war costs at the store, the more the war costs in terms of blood and treasure for the Russian state, the harder it is for Russian citizens to keep this at arm's length. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson is that the regime is factional. As I said, Prigozhin would not have attempted what he attempted if he did not think that he had a chance of succeeding. This was not a Hail Mary. This was something that was communicated. He felt like he could improve his bargaining position vis-a-vis the Kremlin because someone told him that he could. And that suggests that there are factions within the Russian government. And by the way, this doesn't mean that there are, we're talking about, a tug of war between moderates and conservatives, right? We always hear this in the context of Iran, for example, right? That there's this massive struggle for the soul of the Islamic Republic, which is, it's nonsense in the case of Iran, it's nonsense in the case of Russia. What we're actually talking about is factions of parties of interest, right? Whether it's stakeholders in the Russian state, stakeholders in the Russian economy, they all tend to be more or less to varying degrees with the program, but they may have different interests that are being impacted differently by what Vladimir Putin is doing, right? The war has become, over the last year and a half, very personalized in the image of Vladimir Putin, much to the detriment of people in his circle who have economic assets that are now inaccessible abroad, for example, right? So there is some factionalism that's taking place within the Russian regime, and right, the logical corollary of this is we tend to, and when the war it became very clear that the war wasn't going well, we started to talk about the potential for regime change in Russia. So here's a cautionary note, right? Two cautionary notes, actually. First is that Vladimir Putin is not a Johnny-come-lately. He's been doing this for almost a quarter century, and he spent that quarter century effectively eliminating any real semblance of Russian opposition to his rule within the country. There's a reason why people like Garry Kasparov, people like Mikhail Khodorkovsky are not located within Russia. And if you notice, the handful of real intellectual challengers to Vladimir Putin, people like Alexei Navalny, people like Ilya Yashin, people like Vladimir Kara-Murza, all of them are behind bars, right? There is no empty political space in Russia for a real sustained opposition. So what we're actually talking about in the context of regime change is regime change may happen, but it won't be an authoritarian to democratic transition. It'll be an authoritarian to authoritarian transition. It'll be a factional fight within the corridors of power within the Kremlin between people who want to climb down from this war of choice that Vladimir Putin has embarked on and rehabilitate Russia, at least somewhat, in the eyes of the West. And I think there are many, many takers, certainly in places like Europe, that would be very eager to have a new face on the Russian regime that would allow them to resume business as usual. Okay, so that's sort of my general thinking on Prigozhin. The second is sort of the state of the war itself. There's a few metrics I think we need to look at, right? Three really. Well, four: manpower, territory, timing, and support. Right? In terms of manpower, this is, by any yardstick, a massively costly enterprise, and has become a massively costly enterprise for the Russian state. Just exactly how costly is a little bit subject to debate, because the fog of war is operative here, and the Russian government has taken great pains to try to minimize the number of casualties, and the Ukrainian government has taken great pains to try to amplify the number of casualties. So it's been, up until very recently, it's been very, very hard to get an accurate tally of exactly, how costly in human terms this conflict has been. There's a great study, and I commend all of you to read it, that was put out last week by Meduza, the Russian opposition media outlet. They did a joint investigation with another Russian opposition media outlet called Media Zona. And their calculation, based on different methodology, based on, for example, the statistics in terms of excess mortality, based on claims that are filed in probate court, based on sort of registrars of wills and estates, right? Things that happen when people die, and it filters its way into society in terms of real economic terms. They came up with a figure of around 47,000 dead to date. And to date was before the start of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in late May. There's an interesting note in that study, though, which I think is worth pulling out, which is that that's just their sort of back of the envelope estimates of people who have died as a result of these empirical metrics that they're looking at. If you calculate the number of people combined, dead and wounded so severely that they can't return back to the front to fight, that number is closer to 125,000, right? Which is nearly 10 times the number of casualties that the Soviet Union suffered during a decade of occupation in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989. So I think those numbers are instructive, because they demonstrate to you guys that the sort of, in human terms at least, this is an enormously costly venture for the Russian government. In terms of territory, the Ukrainian counteroffensive has been underway for about a month and a half now. The territorial gains have been more modest than the Ukrainians would like, thanks to a number of things, including the Russians blowing up things like dams and making it difficult to traverse terrain. The Ukrainians are making incremental gains. They waited, as I said, this was supposed to be a spring offensive. They waited almost into sort of the dead of summer, because they didn't have the proper equipment. And this is something I want to come back to a little bit later, which is that Western support is robust in aggregate, but in specifics, it's actually very slow. And so Western aid in the context of military materiel is actually dribbling out. It's not rushing out in a torrent. It's coming out. It's being sort of apportioned out very gradually, very slowly. And this is something that the Ukrainians took into account in formulating their military plans. They simply couldn't move until they had the requisite military hardware to move. And so a lot of that has impacted the timing, and it's impacted the sort of the pace with which they can reclaim territory. So this is, I think, one to watch. But what they're doing on the ground and how successful they are on the ground, I think it depends a great deal on the type of military hardware they've already received and what they're going to receive in the next several weeks. And that gets us to timing. Look, I think in the context of sort of grand strategy, the clock works against the Ukrainians and the clock works for the Russians. The Russians are very, very clearly settling into what they believe they want to be a long-haul conflict. The way you know this is not just through the rhetoric of Russian officials, although they say this very clearly, it's through the things that they're practically doing and building. For instance, the Associated Press reported last week about these dozens of new penal colonies that Russia has set up in European Russia, right, geographically close to Ukraine, essentially building a new Gulag archipelago to house what is now thousands of Ukrainians that have either been captured on the battlefield or Ukrainian citizens that have been repatriated into Russia. And according to the AP reporting, the Russians are very busy in currently building more, right? So they don't see this conflict going away anytime soon. And I think Vladimir Putin in his persistence in this war, despite the fact that he's faced much more adverse conditions than that he expected initially. Right? Initially, this was supposed to be a 3-day war in which the Russians marched in and they effected regime change in Kiev, and everything was fine. Obviously, it didn't turn out that way, but the Russians are settling into a long-haul conflict for a couple of reasons. First of all, they understand that the political cycle is working for them and against the Ukrainians, and we'll talk about that in a minute, right? But they understand that there is such a thing as Ukraine fatigue, and it's setting in, certainly in Washington, and setting in European capitals. And they also understand that despite all of the West's bluster, the shock and awe that was supposed to be associated with Western sanctions has not fundamentally upended the Russian economy, right? Russia's economy is not doing well, but the Russian economy is not collapsing. So through those two metrics, they've sort of figured out that they can last and in their terms, hopefully outlast the Ukrainian defense. And in the context of Ukraine, the other calculation kicks in. Ukrainian officials are enormously frustrated about the fact that the aid from the West is not coming quickly enough, right? So anytime you talk to a Ukrainian official here in Washington or in Europe, they will tell you about the fact that, the clock is ticking. They're enormously worried about how the politics of this is going to shake out in the run up to the 2024 election here, and what that internal debate here is going to have in terms of alliance cohesion moving forward, right? And so we just had the NATO summit. The NATO summit was sort of, I think, a mixed bag for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians didn't get what they wanted, which is a clear path to membership for Ukraine. In fact, the Russians got a message that they really wanted, because you heard European officials talk a great deal about the fact that there is no possibility of membership for Ukraine while the war is on. So if you're a Russian, what you're taking away from this is, as long as the war is on, we don't have to worry about Ukraine in NATO. That is not a moderating message, really, for the Russians. But the lesson here, I think, is that the Ukrainians feel the clock ticking very loudly. I think they're correct. And I think they are, this counteroffensive for them matters fundamentally, right? It's do or die. Because if the counteroffensive is materially less than it's cracked up to be, people here in the United States and in Europe that are arguing for a scaled back Western involvement in the Ukraine war and agitating for some sort of settlement, those voices become louder. The voices in favor of supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes become much softer, right? And that gets us to the third point, which is the state of American and Western strategy. Here, because of the pace of the support, which I mentioned earlier, right, the way I would describe it is American policy is half pregnant. We are, I advisedly, right, where everybody stands where they sit. My family, I come from Russian refuseniks who came out of the Soviet Union in the 1970s. I am a very large proponent of America and the free world using the arsenal of democracy that we built up over 6+ decades before the Cold War and during the Cold War to actually do something meaningful about the long-term threat posed by Russia. And we're not expending that whole arsenal. We're only talking about a small fraction of it. So I think it's money well spent generally on a personal level. But I am enormously concerned about the fact that we haven't set strategic objectives for our aid. The White House has made hay of the fact that President Biden intones that we are with Ukraine for as long as it takes. But he never answers the second part of that phrase, which is as long as it takes to do what? What are we in the business of doing? If the goal, as it seems to be on the part of the White House, is to ensure Ukraine's security against future predation by Russia, that's a perfectly legitimate goal, but nobody's ever articulated that. And in the absence of us articulating a clear end state and objective for our Ukraine engagement, others have begun to do so in our stead to try to fill that vacuum. So and so there's a spectrum of opinion about what this war is intended to do across the West, and it tends to vary actually very widely. So in the context of Ukraine, the Ukrainians have been pretty forthright about what they want, right? I call it the 4 R's, right? They want return of population, which is people who have been sort of sent into Russia from territory that's been occupied by the Russian military since the start of the war. They want return of population, return of territory, including the Crimean Peninsula, which was unilaterally annexed by Russia in 2014. They want restitution for urban centers, for civilian infrastructure that have been destroyed by Russia's war of choice, and they want reconstruction. They need a reconstruction plan, and they want to be partners in it. They don't want simply just want a Marshall Plan. They want to sort of to be stakeholders in it. This is, by the way, the context, the backdrop against which the Ukrainian suggestions of that have now been taken up by the European Parliament, they've been taken up by Congress, of seizing Russian foreign exchange reserves that are held in the West. There's about $300 billion worth of Russian foreign exchange reserves that are escrowed in different Western financial institutions. The Ukrainian pitch has been, for a long time, hey, give us that money, because in one fell swoop, you punish the Russians, but you also give us at least the seed capital to begin reconstruction. And so this is the sort of the Ukrainian value proposition. But our allies in NATO, our Eastern European allies in NATO, which are geographically very close to Russia, are actually articulating something else. So, for example, the Lithuanian foreign minister, the Lithuanian president, have talked a lot about the end state of the war should be that Russia can never be a threat again. And from their perspective, right, territorially very close to the Russian Federation, this makes total sense. But in practical terms, what they're actually talking about is effectively regime change in Moscow. And this is something that, quite frankly, puts them in a very different place from the United States, right? We're not arguing the merits of whether we should carry out regime change in Moscow, but I think both on the left and on the right, any sane analyst of the situation, the political situation in Russia now, would tell you that this is very, very far from being an achievable goal. So what we now have is we have a bit of intellectual disparity, a bit of fog in the strategy surrounding what we want to do with regard to the war in Ukraine, right? And here, 2024 looms very large, right? The approaches to Ukraine differ on the Republican side, and they differ greatly. And the White House, I'm sorry to say, is playing politics with Ukraine. And what I mean by this is that my office is here in Washington, like the JPC's offices. I was here last summer, at the tail end of last summer, when the big tranche, the $48 billion tranche of Ukraine aid was proposed by the White House. And the White House was being very non-transparent about what was actually in that package. And at that time, Republican opposition to American aid to Ukraine was in a far different place intellectually than it is now. Right now, we've sort of congealed a skeptical consensus. Back then, there was not a skeptical consensus. So you had members of the House, members of the Senate, who were simply saying, we just want to know, that's a lot of money. We just want to know that Ukraine is going to get the right things, that Ukraine is going to get the proper aid to achieve strategic objectives to push back against Russia. And the Biden administration at that time had a choice to make. They could play in bipartisan fashion and open the books, explain exactly what they were doing, explain what they were going to give to Ukraine with the money that they were allocating. Or they could play politics with it. They could, for lack of a better term, they could pull a Nancy Pelosi and say, you have to pass the aid bill in order to know what's in it. And unfortunately, they chose the latter route. And what this has actually done is it has shunted a number of people, influential policymakers, both in the House and in the Senate, who were completely convincible a year ago into a camp where they are now, very staunchly opposed to bankrolling this effort. And they become even more opposed to bankrolling this effort the longer we go on without a clear declaration of what the desired end state for the United States is. So that's sort of where we are, I think. There's a lot there. So, but I'm going to stop there because I know that I can see from her face, Shoshana has some questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilan. Of course, I have questions. This wouldn't be any fun if I didn't have questions. So starting on your last point, the one about accounting. So it's not only money that hasn't been accounted for, it's also weapons. And so one of the concerns that people have is we are clearly draining our supplies. We have no Stinger missiles left. We don't know what we've given them, or not everybody knows what we've given them. How much trouble are we in? Because we don't know things. How do you rebuild your military if you don't know what you don't have? How does Congress weigh in on this if you don't know?
Well, and also, right, so the corollary of that is how, without knowing that information, we can't tell whether what we're doing with regard to Ukraine is a good bet, is a good value for our dollar, right? So actually, so I think this is maybe the most important question. So my institute, the American Foreign Policy Council, we've been sort of thinking about this for a long time, and I've been struck by the fact. First of all, right, let's posit that this is not a new conversation. The problem that we have, the legacy problem that we have, is that Ukraine is famously corrupt, and as a country, and Ukraine successive administrations in Kiev have talked a very good game about rooting out corruption. They've done very little to do so. And so there is ample reason to be skeptical that all of a sudden now the massive infusions of Western aid and Western capital are going to be spent well and not sort of expropriated, not sort of shunted to the side or disappear down the black hole of state corruption. I do think that there is a story to be told here because this is something that real legitimate like-minded reformers in Kiev, in the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, now in government, in the Zelensky administration, have been thinking about for a long time. And they've been doing a number of things, right? They've set up a national anti-corruption bureau. They have set up online bidding and sort of transparency and commercial platforms for government contracting, things like, right? There's all sorts of really interesting steps that they've taken, but we don't know about any of them. And the biggest piece of advice that I have been giving to Ukrainian officials has been that they need to tell that story. They need to explain to Western audiences who have become stakeholders in the Ukrainian state that this money is actually, that we're keeping track of this, right? That the Ukrainians are they may not be perfect, but they understand that there's a problem, they're working towards it. So for anybody who's interested, my institute actually last month launched a sort of a monthly bulletin called the Ukraine Reform Monitor, for precisely this reason, because I think as an American think tank, we have two jobs. One is to track the sort of the pace of reform within Ukraine so that the American people understand that this isn't money that's just going into a black hole, right? That there's actually things happening. And the second is that there is a internal political discussion that is happening in the American body politic about, to what extent should we continue to support Ukraine? The Ukrainians happen to be busy, right? They're fighting a war, but this is essential information. You simply cannot sustain this level of support for Ukraine if the American people have become convinced that this is not a good use of American dollars, right? So to me, this is, I think, a very important conversation to have, right? The military conversation, I think, is a secondary conversation. Not secondary in terms of importance, but secondary in terms of topic. There is a real resource question in the context of, what have we given them? Where has it gone? How does that, in what state does that leave the U.S. military? These are legitimate questions. I'll leave that up to sort of to experts who sort of really understand the U.S. Defense arsenal. I would point out that this is not happening in a vacuum. So the racking and stacking is happening in hostile foreign capitals like Beijing, but so too is the calculus of what America and its allies are prepared to do in defense of an ally that's been attacked, right? And this is where the sort of the steadfastness of the Western alliance in the context of Ukraine becomes really important. when laid against the scenario of a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan, for example, right? Because what the Chinese see us doing in Ukraine now is what they're going to expect us to do in the context of Taiwan later. And so my sense is what they've seen so far has been enough to give them pause about the idea that an invasion and occupation of Taiwan is going to be a cakewalk. And I kind of want to keep it that way.
That's a good idea. But let's stick with thought here. We really had the United States. We really had three possibilities before the invasion. One was to find a negotiated settlement and push the Ukrainians toward it. One was to do it ourselves after the invasion. And the third was to arm the Ukrainians, as President Biden said, for as long as it takes. As you know, as long as it takes is a great way to lose support in the American public, because our steadfastness, and you remember Vietnam, and I remember Vietnam. I'm a lot older than you, but I remember Vietnam. Would it have been different? Sure, surely it would have. Would it have been better if we just said, look, to the Russians, you can't do this. You can't have this territory. A contingent of Marines could have taken Crimea, right? Looking back, should we have? But looking forward, is there a point at which we have to say to ourselves as Americans, the Ukrainians cannot do it, so send in the Marines?
So big question, not an easy question. I would point out something. I think you're hitting upon something very important, which is that there's no substitute for seriousness, right? And the lack of one of the great successes of Russian propaganda, right? Not disinformation, because it's not. It wasn't intended to sort of to change the facts, but it was intended to shape perception. So propaganda over the last quarter century has been to get Western countries to believe that the Russian military is 10 feet tall, right? You have Russian officials talking about wonder weapons, hypersonics, robotic tanks, sort of all this stuff, right? This next generation military, and Western officials over time have shaped their responses accordingly, right? So a lot of NATO policy over the last 20 years has been, and European policy has been, hey, we have to change what we're doing so we don't make Moscow angry, right? And in fact, to the point where in the late 1990s, NATO actually took this crazy step of creating a NATO-Russia Council, early 2000s, creating a NATO-Russia Council where Russia was supposed to have veto power over NATO exercises, and it was supposed to be, it didn't last very long, but the idea was to mollify the Kremlin, to create confidence in the Kremlin. We essentially put Russia, singular Russia, on the same level as 20 plus members of NATO, right? In terms of their veto power over NATO exercises. So the one thing to me that is very clear from this conflict is that the war has demolished this idea of the Russians militarily being 10 feet tall, right? The joke, right? You've heard it. I think you've all heard it. That Russia began the war in Ukraine as the second strongest military in Europe, and it's ending the war as the second strongest military in Ukraine, right? And so there's some truth to that, right? And I think the long-term effects of that are actually very important. Because what you said about Crimea, what you said about us being forced to, or us rightly signaling that we're pushing back against Russia, something that didn't happen before now. My sense is that, as you saw from the readouts from the NATO summit in Vilnius earlier this month, and from other statements from Western officials, we've sort of crossed the Rubicon. There's a very different thinking about Russia. So if we were self-deterred before, which is why we didn't send troops to liberate Crimea, things like that, my sense is it's a very different game moving forward. Now, that doesn't mean that we should at all be eager in putting boots on the ground to fight the Russians. However, it does mean that NATO planners should be less circumspect about planning for the defense of the alliance. It also helps explain why the Finns, the Swedes, and now the Ukrainians want so desperately to get into the alliance, right? You can sort of hang together or you can hang separately.
So go to the greatest fear that people have, and that is the use of nuclear weapons in Europe. my question is more technical than political, I think. Can the West accurately assess the possibility or the probability of the things that drive Putin to decide, yes, I will? Because if he does that, all the other bets, including the
Right.
bets about NATO, including the bets about China and Taiwan, will change. Everything will be different after that moment. How good are we at assessing where we're going here?
Not good enough, I think. Look, empirically speaking, if I were to say to you, I have 150,000 troops, and I'm going to use that manpower to take over a city of 2.5 million people, Kiev, a city of 1.5 million people, Odessa, simultaneously. The numbers just don't work, right? They don't work unless you are being told information that's incorrect, that's shaping your worldview, right? Vladimir Putin very clearly believed that Russians would be greeted as liberators once they invaded Ukraine, right? And the sort of the safe bet is that no one has ever gotten promoted by telling Vladimir Putin something he didn't want to hear. The reason that's important is because it tends to shape or distort the way Putin thinks about risks and rewards, right? He is an insular leader that has constricted his circle of advice and decision-making. And so it inherently makes it very opaque. It makes it hard for us to understand that he's racking and stacking the risks of nuclear usage the way we would rack and stack the risks of nuclear usage. I think it's very clear that at a minimum, he is trying to escalate to de-escalate. If you remember, back in September, Putin did a couple of things simultaneously. He unilaterally declared sovereignty over 4 different provinces in Ukraine, declared a partial mobilization, right, which was supposed to be on paper, 300,000 people. It was actually closer to 1 million, but that's what it was. But there was a third component to what he was doing, which not a lot of people talked about, but it was very, very telling, because it suggests that it sort of outlines the contours of his strategy. He said, these 4 provinces are now part of the Russian Federation, and we will defend the totality of the Russian Federation with nuclear weapons, right? So what he was trying to do was he was trying to salami slice his way to some sort of stand down position in Ukraine, right? If the Western community had said, okay, fine, listen, you get Crimea, you get Donetsk, you get Luhansk, you get Zaporizhia region, whatever it is, and now it's Russian territory, this would have been optimal from the Russian perspective as a starting point to sue for peace. This is not what happened. Probably because, it takes 2 to tango. The Ukrainians have laid out their demands, their requirements, their sort of national imperatives, those 4 R's that I talked about. They don't really match up with anything that the Russians have said to date. And so there's really not a basis for dialogue, at least not yet. That makes Putin very erratic. That sort of injects this doubt about, escalation, about nuclear weapons usage, things like that. But the general consensus seems to be, at least for now, that he is using nuclear brinksmanship as a negotiating strategy rather than as an operational strategy. I don't think anybody in the West is sanguine enough to bet the farm on that, though. And so we have to get a lot smarter. And this is where, as somebody who, studied undergraduate and graduate in the 1990s, when Kremlinology was fast going out of vogue, right? We had won the Cold War, therefore we no longer had to worry about Russia. And so, everything I had learned, at the kitchen table when I was growing up was sort of passé all of a sudden. Suddenly it was not important. It's really important now, because now the context in which Putin is making those decisions, the people who are giving him advice, people like Pregosian until recently, people like the defense minister, people like the foreign minister, and a whole crop of oligarchs and military officials that are not really well known in the West, but need to be, because the way they're approaching this issue is enormously influential on Putin's decision-making, right? We have to get smart on that, and we have to get much smarter on that very, very soon.
So I can't let you go without raising your other area of expertise, which is Iran. Iran is violating UN sanctions to provide Russia with weapons, and Russia is violating US sanctions by dealing with Iran in various ways. Tell us about that in like 7 seconds.
7. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, take 10.
Okay, I tend to.
Yeah.
So I have really been watching sort of what the Iranians have been doing in the context of Russia and the Ukraine war very very closely. And it's fascinating because it is a fundamental inversion of the power balance between Moscow and Tehran, right? So for a quarter of a century, the Russians were the senior partner, the Iranians were the junior partner. Where the Russians were using their permanent seat on the Security Council, were using their senior posts, senior roles in multilateral institutions to water down sanctions, to run interference for the Islamic Republic, and to essentially dilute the effect of Western attempts to squeeze the Iranians, to pressure the Iranians, to slow down the Iranian nuclear program. Since the start of the Ukraine war, the shoe's on the other foot. All of a sudden, very unexpectedly, the Iranians are the senior partner. And I don't think that's an exaggeration, the way it's being the way I'm seeing these politics move. Last summer, it wasn't Iranian officials who had, as they had in years prior, traveled to Moscow to bend the knee in front of Vladimir Putin to ask for support. It was Vladimir Putin traveling to Tehran to ask for Iranian assistance. And the reason he was forced to do that was because he had previously gone to places like Kazakhstan, places like China, and asked for manpower and asked for military material, things like drones. And up until that point, he hadn't received anything. And so the Iranians staked out a very activist position in support of Russia's war in Ukraine. Now, for Iran, potentially the downside of this is huge. Because I spent a lot of time working on a different project, spent a lot of time in Europe over the last 8 months. The European dialogue on Iran has undergone, at least temporarily, has undergone a sea change. Europe is currently embroiled in the most consequential land war in the last 80 years. And the Iranians have voluntarily waded into this fight. So something that was a peripheral Middle Eastern issue is now a continental European issue. And so you have a very different tenor of discussions about Iran that are taking place in the European Parliament. The thing that's beginning to mute those discussions is the Biden administration. It's the Biden administration's attempts to, and I don't believe, by the way, I do not believe that the Biden administration is anywhere close to hammering out a durable understanding with the Iranians. What I think is a more accurate description is that the Biden administration is trying to pay off the Islamic Republic to keep them more or less quiet until after the re-election. And this is setting the tenor of the way the White House is talking or not talking about Iran. If you've noticed, the White House doesn't really say much about Iranian provision of drones to Russia for use in the battlefield in Ukraine because they have other fish to fry. But the lessons, unfortunately, that Europe is hearing from this is that just at the time when Europe is beginning to stiffen its spine on Iran, the way you and I and everybody else have sort of been advocating for a long time, the White House is going wobbly.
So, Ilan, as we come to the end of this program, which I think has been fascinating and enlightening and has taught us a lot of things that we need to know as we watch the news and read the papers and go online and find misinformation everywhere. This has been really important. It's also been really depressing. And people who tune in periodically know that I don't like to leave on a down note. So every guest is asked to leave us with a positive thought. Can you give us a positive thought?
Absolutely. Interestingly, going back to the first question you asked me about Ukraine and corruption and sort of, graft and all this. What's really fascinating to me, and as someone who's spent time in Ukraine and sort of, talks to Ukrainian officials all the time, is there's really been, and gradual, but jump-started by the conflict, a sea change in Ukrainian thinking and also in Ukrainian self-identity. there is a tremendous amount of dynamism that's happening on the ground in anti-corruption terms, right? Everything from, removing the head of the Ukrainian Supreme Court because he was found to be taking bribes, to setting up the, to sort of reformulating the national police and restructuring it, putting things like the need to get marriage licenses entirely online, so you eliminate the opportunity for corrupt local officials to ask you for bribe, things like that, that in the aggregate actually really matter because they change the sort of the economic and societal sort of fabric of the country. But there's also a shift in thinking. And there is, and this is something that we can sort of talk about later, but the change in the way Ukraine thinks about the world and about where it sort of belongs in the world. And also, by the way, the way it thinks about countries like Israel, by the way, right? All things aside, not yet fully reflected in the way they vote at the UN Security Council, I would say, or at the United Nations. However, for families like mine who are very attuned to the sort of the Ukrainian role in anti-Semitism during the Cold War and during World War II, it has really been a bit of a revelation to talk to ordinary Ukrainians and to understand that for whatever reason, as they have gravitated toward this idea that Russia is a threat and Russia is an enduring threat to their national self-identity, they have decided that anti-Semitism is the Russian part. And so they're beginning to pivot away from that. And I think that's not really well understood and it's not appreciated. And the Ukrainians aren't really communicating very well because, they have other fish to fry. They're a little bit busy at the moment. But this is, I think, very, very consequential. And I think it's going to rise in prominence if, hopefully in the near future, whenever the war ends, in terms of how Ukraine deals with the Middle East, how Ukraine deals with Israel specifically, and how Ukraine thinks about itself in the broader compact.
I will take that as a positive statement. And thank you for a most enlightening and really important hour. Ilan Berman, you're great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.